Hello and welcome to Cars with Kasey, Episode 8. Today I will be going over the story of the Ford Ranger in the United States. However, the story of this Ford cannot start without the story of the Edsel. Ford founded Edsel in 1956 as a luxury brand. At the time, Ford occupied the bottom of Ford's price range, under Mercury and then Lincoln. Ford planned to make the Edsels more exciting cars in the way that Pontiac was oriented for General Motors. Edsel planned to enter in the same or slightly higher price point as Mercury. In 1958, Edsel released their first cars to disaster. A recession had struck, reducing demand for cars, especially mid-sized ones, where Edsel was positioned. While Edsels were designed as powerful, exciting cars, a shift to economy cars was happening. Not only that, Edsel's unconventional styling made them very unpopular, and facelifts would not come in time before the company was closed exactly 3 years after its founding in 1959. Edsel's lowest price model was the Ranger, filling the same range as the Ford Galaxy or the Mercury Medalist at the time. The Ranger came as either a coupe or a sedan, with the hardtop versions of each being available, or the car could come as a 5-door wagon. In 1958, the model only came with a 5.9-liter V8 that could be linked to either a 3-speed automatic or a 3-speed manual. The engine produced 303 horsepower and 400 foot-pounds of torque, and was the first of any Ford to use this V8. The 1959 Edsel used a 4.8-liter V8 from other Ford models, producing 206 horsepower in a manual or 212 horsepower in an automatic. The Ranger also used a 3.7-liter inline-six, which produced 120 horsepower. To fix the disastrous styling, the Ranger was facelifted slightly too late for the 1960 model year. The 1960 Ranger lost the wagon but gained a soft-top convertible. The Edsel came very close to being a Ford, with only a minor styling distinguishing it from its Ford counterparts. It had all 3 engine options of the previous Rangers and the same transmissions for 1960. It also retained the same 120-inch wheelbase and 4,000-pound weight. But since Edsel was shut down in 1959, no 1960 Edsel was actually built in 1960. The Ranger convertible is the second rarest Edsel ever built, at only 76 examples being built, topped by the 9-passenger 1960 Edsel Villager with only 59 examples. Due to their collectability and rarity, Edsel Ranger convertibles are often faked. In 1965, the Ranger name returned, this time as a trim for the F-Series Ford trucks. It was a top-end sport trim akin to what the Platinum is today for the F-Series. The trim gave the 4th-generation trucks carpeting, bucket seats, a center console, and other enhancements. 1965 to 1966 Rangers are quite rare, as at the time the F-Series was still primarily a work vehicle, and so a luxury package wasn't desired. For the 5th-generation F-Series, the Ranger was still to be the top-end trim, but it had even more cosmetic upgrades from the previous generation. And in 1970, the Ranger XLT trim was introduced, being the new top trim. The Ranger XLT added all that the Ranger did, plus faux wood inserts inside and out, and a soundproof roof. In 1975, the Ford F-150 was introduced as what it still is today, as a companion to the F-100. In 1980, the Ranger Lariat trim was added as the new top trim above the XLT. In 1982, the Ranger name was dropped from the F-Series trims and was replaced by what is now Standard, and that was the Standard, XL, XLS, and Lariat XLT trims. The year after, the F-100 would be discontinued to allow the Ranger truck and the F-150 to take its place. The Ranger we know was launched in 1983 as a compact pickup. Despite being small, it could match the F-100's weight capacities. The Little Ranger was powered by an array of engines. The smallest was a 2-liter inline-4, followed by a 2.3-liter inline-4, a 2.8-liter V6, and a 2.2-liter diesel inline-4. The truck came with various 3 to 4-speed automatics or 4 to 5-speed manual transmissions, and had either a 6-foot or 7-foot bed with regular cab, though a super cab was offered starting in 1986. In that same year, in 1986, a Ranger GT was marketed in California. The Ranger GT was a package for single-cab Rangers with rear-wheel drive. It was low, small, and powered by a 2.9-liter V6 that produced 140 horsepower, which was the most powerful engine option at the time. In 1988, the package was expanded to include cosmetic upgrades for the truck. An upgraded version was planned for 1990 with a 220 horsepower V6, but the Ranger GT was shelved altogether instead. The second generation of Ford Ranger was introduced in 1993, and unlike the previous version, the second generation was not designed as a small F-150, but it was rather very rounded and aerodynamic. The Ranger could also now come with a step-side bed rather than just a flat-side bed. The Ranger was otherwise unchanged from previous years mechanically. The Ford Ranger was also given to Mazda to sell as the Mazda B series. Also new in 1993 was the Ford Ranger Splash. The Ranger Splash lowered the suspension and gave the truck decals, bucket seats, a center console, and electronic mirrors. Soon after 1998, the third generation Ranger was introduced. While the third generation was visibly similar to the second, it had an array of upgrades from the previous generation Rangers. The third generation Ranger in 1998 was also the first compact pickup to have 4 doors. The Ford Ranger was also the first electric vehicle produced by Ford in the United States, with a 90 horsepower single cab costing about $103,000 in 2025 dollars. In 1995, 2001, 2005, and 2006, the Ranger saw slight facelifts, with a minor interior update in 2007. But after 2005, the Ranger lost its step-side option. The Ranger was slated to be discontinued in 2008, so no cosmetic changes were made after 2007, though minor updates for the vehicle itself were made, such as audio ports and audio package upgrades. The Ranger received a variety of trims through this generation that are now common in other Ford trucks, such as the FX4 package, the STX trim, and the Trimmer package. However, whereas the current Trimmer for the F-Series is largely an off-roading focused trim, the Trimmer was largely a cosmetic package for the Ranger that also added audio upgrades. But in 2011, the Ranger was discontinued for the United States market. Globally, the T6 Ford Ranger was manufactured where the Ranger left off in 2012, but as a mid-sized truck rather than a compact pickup. The Ranger was not brought home to the U.S. until 2019. Unlike previous Rangers that had multiple and often unrelated versions worldwide, the T6 Ranger became the sole Ranger sold by Ford. But this Ranger isn't actually American, and instead it hails from Australia. For introduction into the US, the Ranger introduced direct injection and turbochargers to boost power and efficiency. The Ranger's safety equipment also had to be upgraded, and the Ranger's payload capacity was increased. However, this Ranger was only available in 2 configurations, either a Super Crew cab with a short bed or a Super Cab with a long bed. While available in either rear-wheel drive or four-wheel drive, all American Rangers came on the lifted 4x4 chassis of foreign Rangers. And unlike foreign Rangers that could have diesel or manual transmissions, the American Ranger could only have a 2.3-liter inline-4 and a 10-speed automatic transmission. Whereas this Ranger gained a Raptor version globally, it was never brought to the U.S. However, the second generation of T6 Ranger was designed in the U.S. and did bring a Raptor. This generation had more options for drivetrains, but in the U.S. it was still only restricted to one cab option, that being Super Crew. The current Ranger, introduced in 2024 to the United States, had the 2.3-liter inline-4 from the previous Ranger as well as a 2.7-liter V6 from the F-150. And in the American Raptor, a 3-liter V6 produces 405 horsepower. However, the diesel engine options are still not available in the U.S. The chassis of this new Ranger is reinforced and enlarged from previous Rangers. The Trimmer and Wildtrak trims are available overseas, but so far the Raptor remains the only off-road specialized Ranger in the United States. A plug-in hybrid version also exists overseas, but again is not available in the U.S., and in 2024 a Super Duty version was revealed as a modern counterpart to what the Ranger was originally. It exists for markets where the F-150 is either too expensive or too big to do its job. Ironically, the Ranger Super Duty will cost about the same overpriced tag as the F-150. The Ranger Super Duty is not planned to come to the U.S. because it would outcompete the Ford F-150. In other words, Ford knows its best-selling vehicles are not that good, and it wants to keep that low standard for as long as possible in the U.S. The Super Duty is a loaded work truck available in any cab format. It has locking 4x4 differentials, a 34-gallon tank, onboard scales for the flatbed, an engine snorkel, a reinforced chassis, and a 3-liter diesel V6. This will give the Ranger Super Duty superior range, superior capacity, superior maneuverability, and superior survivability. The Ranger Super Duty is expected to have about 25% more towing capacity than the standard Ranger, and is only limited by Australian law rather than the design of the truck. The reason I mentioned this global Ranger for an episode about the American Ranger is that the Super Duty Ranger was spotted testing in the United States under barely any camouflage recently. This might imply that Ford is now considering bringing this work truck to the US. Let's hope they do at a reasonable price, not the $55,000 MSRP for what is basically a small flatbed F-150. The current Bronco is also a derivative of the Ranger, and it shares many components. However, the Bronco, unlike the Ranger, managed to keep its manual transmission in the US when the Ranger did not. Personally, I would like to see a Ranger with any cab format, diesel engines, and a manual transmission here in the US, but Ford currently doesn't seem to have any intention of doing that. But that is the story of the American Ford Ranger. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget that you can find this podcast on YouTube, Instagram, and Spotify under the same name, Cars with Kasey. And on Instagram and YouTube, I can be found under the username TavlingAppa. That's Tavling, Tavling, Appa, APA. I've enjoyed talking to you in this one, and I look forward to talking to you in the next.